When a nation becomes fixated on its outer achievements, its military prowess, technological dominance, political influence, it often begins to neglect the subtle but essential forces that hold it together from within. What we perceive as strength from the outside may be nothing more than a fragile shell if it is not supported by inner harmony. This disconnection between appearance and essence creates an illusion of stability. Eventually, the illusion shatters. What remains is the truth. Any system, any body, any nation that builds outward without balancing inward is already in the process of collapsing. Israel, like many powerful entities throughout history, has mastered the art of projecting strength. Its defense capabilities are among the most advanced in the world. Its intelligence infrastructure is unmatched. Its economy is robust, with innovation flourishing in sectors like cybersecurity, agriculture, and medicine. But the deeper question is, what lies beneath this surface? Is there alignment between the people and their leaders? Is there cohesion in the soul of the nation? Or is it all held together by fear, force, and fragmented narratives? A martial artist who only trains his fists but ignores his breath will one day find that his strength has become brittle. The same principle applies to a nation. When focus is directed solely at external defense and power projection, the internal systems, social trust, civic unity, ethical grounding begin to decay. And in Israel's case, this decay is no longer hidden. It has surfaced through mass protests, through political discontent, through growing divisions within the population itself. External strength without inner harmony leads to fracture. The two must grow together, or not at all. The imbalance is not merely philosophical, it manifests in very real consequences. When a nation's identity is tied to perpetual conflict, when its sense of self depends on the presence of an external enemy, it becomes locked in a cycle of defensiveness. Every disagreement becomes a threat. Every voice of dissent becomes a traitor. In such an atmosphere, inner dialogue, without dialogue, there can be no healing. Without healing, the internal environment becomes toxic, and from that toxicity, collapse becomes inevitable. Israel finds itself now not just in conflict with its neighbors, but in conflict with itself. The internal tensions between secular and religious, between liberal and conservative, between nationalist and progressive, are not new, but they are deepening. These tensions erode the shared vision that once united the people. The laws passed no longer feel representative. The decisions made in leadership chambers no longer reflect the will of the many. This is the silent implosion that happens long before any wall falls or border shifts. The people begin to feel estranged from their own government. And the government, in turn, begins to lose its legitimacy. In the martial tradition, it is said that strength without purpose becomes violence. Purpose without strength becomes fantasy. Only when the two are in harmony can true power emerge. Israel's current approach reveals a misalignment. It is pouring immense energy into holding its ground on the world stage, yet it is losing its spiritual and social center. The consequences are visible. Young citizens questioning military service, citizens marching by the tens of thousands against judicial reforms, the widening gulf between the diaspora and the homeland. These are not isolated incidents. They are indicators of a deeper misalignment. When the human body is unwell, symptoms appear: a fever, a cough, fatigue. None of these are the root cause, but they are signs that something within is failing. In the same way, the visible unrest in Israel is a symptom. The root is a disconnection from the values that once defined it. A nation that once claimed to be a homeland for all Jews now wrestles with the meaning of inclusion. A society that once drew strength from resilience now struggles to find unity in diversity. This is the paradox of power. It can blind those who hold it. When there is too much focus on control, there is not enough room left for compassion. And without compassion, a society cannot sustain itself. There is an old teaching that says, when the wind is strong, even the tallest trees can fall if their roots are weak. But a humble blade of grass, grounded and flexible, will bend and survive. Israel today appears as a strong tree, but strength that is not rooted in harmony is only temporary. True resilience is found not in resistance, but in adaptability. In its current state, Israel is resisting change, it is resisting reflection, it is resisting the very voices within its own borders that are calling for a new way. The longer this resistance continues, the more brittle the structure becomes. Eventually, the collapse will not come from without, it will arise from within. Harmony is not something that appears when conflict ends, it is a practice cultivated in the midst of disagreement. It is the ability to listen without defensiveness, to speak without aggression, to act without domination. A nation that forgets this loses its moral compass. And when the compass is lost, no amount of strength can steer the ship. The erosion of inner harmony in Israel is not just political, it is cultural, psychological, and spiritual. The sense of collective purpose is diminishing. The shared mythos that once held the people together is unraveling. In such a condition, all the weapons in the world cannot guarantee survival. Collapse begins in the mind, then spreads to the heart, and finally manifests in the world. When a martial artist begins to train, he first learns discipline, not of the body, but of the mind. Without inner discipline, every technique is hollow. In the same way, without inner harmony, every institution of the state becomes performative. Courts lose their sanctity, parliaments become theaters of ego, security becomes paranoia. The collapse of Israel is not just a headline, it is a process that has already begun. A slow, silent descent that many refuse to see. But the signs are there for those who observe closely, and the lesson it offers is clear. External strength is not enough. Without harmony, strength becomes a burden. Without unity, progress becomes a mirage. And without purpose, survival becomes suffering. The way forward is not through more force. It is through deep listening, through reconnection with values, with people, with purpose. Only then can the tide be turned. But if the current course continues, the collapse will complete its cycle, not with noise, but with silence. The silence of a nation that forgot to care for its own heart. The silence of a nation that forgot to care for its own heart. When a society sustains itself on division, the seeds of its destruction are already sown. Power that thrives by dividing people against each other may appear effective in the short term, but over time, that division becomes the very force that tears the structure apart. Unity is not merely a slogan, it is the invisible thread that holds the layers of a nation together, its people, its institutions, its vision. Israel has long projected itself as a nation of resilience, a homeland forged in hardship, surviving against all odds. But the present condition reveals a deeper truth, that power built upon internal conflict, exclusion, and unresolved history cannot maintain peace. Peace cannot coexist with continuous fragmentation. When every step forward is taken while stepping on another's rights, Every progress becomes a step toward eventual instability. A house built on uneven stones, no matter how strong its walls, will one day collapse under its own weight. Across decades, Israel has become deeply divided. Politically, religiously, socially, the divisions are no longer hidden, no longer buried under the narratives of survival or unity. They are exposed in protests that fill the streets, in courtrooms that challenge the nation's very legal framework, in the widening chasm between the religious and the secular, between Arab and Jew, between settlers and citizens. These divisions are not minor disagreements. They are rifts that question the core identity of the state. When a people no longer agree on what their country stands for, their bond to it weakens. When the concept of us becomes fragmented into multiple thems, the center can no longer hold. In martial training, there is a lesson. The opponent is not always outside. Sometimes the most dangerous battle is the one happening within. When a fighter is unsure, when his mind is torn between fear and aggression, he is no longer effective. The same applies to nations. Israel is battling itself from the inside out. Leadership has begun to exploit differences rather than heal them. Policies are drawn not for balance but for control, and in this process people are no longer guided by shared vision but by distrust. Distrust of each other, of their institutions, of the future. That distrust is now manifesting in social unrest, in youth turning away from traditional paths, in communities closing off from one another. These are not surface level issues. They are systemic symptoms of a deeper disorder. Power without cohesion creates confusion. It creates a sense of always needing to defend, to dominate, to outmaneuver. Israel's reliance on control rather than dialogue has intensified over time. Security becomes the lens through which every citizen is judged. Every policy is justified. But security without peace is just a cage. It might be gilded, it might be well defended, but it is still a place of fear. Real power lies in trust. And trust is built not through force, but through fairness. When people believe they are treated equally, when they feel they belong, peace begins to take root. But when people feel constantly categorized, surveilled or excluded, the soil becomes dry. And in dry soil, nothing lasting can grow. Division is not only a national issue in Israel, it is also a psychological one. Citizens are carrying the weight of generational trauma while simultaneously being pushed into ideological camps. Everything becomes polarized. You are either loyal or disloyal, religious or secular, left or right. This binary lens destroys nuance. And without nuance, people stop hearing one another. They shout, they react, but they do not understand. In such a climate, even the most well-meaning voices get lost. The country becomes a place of noise without music, action without harmony. Martial practice teaches that the body and mind must move as one. If the body moves in one direction and the mind resists, there is no flow, only friction. Israel is currently living in that state of friction. Each part of society pulling in a different direction, weakening the whole. History has shown us that empires fall not only because of outside invaders, but often because of internal decay. When Rome fell, it was not a sudden collapse. It was a long erosion of civic unity, moral discipline, and social cohesion. Israel, despite its technological advancement and military strength, is vulnerable for the same reasons. The internal erosion has begun. And it is visible not just in politics, but in the daily life of its people. Education is polarized, media is fractured, and conversations are laced with suspicion. Even within families, ideological lines are being drawn. A society where brothers argue not over ideas, but over identity cannot stand for long. True leadership is not about control, but cultivation. It is the act of nurturing harmony, not enforcing silence. In many instances, the leadership in Israel has chosen to dominate rather than to dialogue. The voice of the people has often been dismissed as disobedience. Protesters are labeled as enemies. Critics are treated as threats. But when governance suppresses rather than listens, it loses the opportunity to evolve. And what does not evolve collapses. A martial artist who does not adapt to his opponent's rhythm will be struck. A nation that refuses to adapt to the needs and voices of its people will eventually fall. Not from one blow, but from 1,000 ignored whispers. It is easy to mistake momentary control for long-term stability. It is easy to believe that the presence of strong laws or walls will prevent disintegration. But the deeper truth is this: where division is normalized, collapse is inevitable. Israel's political landscape is a reflection of this normalization. Instead of bridging divides, many leaders have benefited from them. They have risen to power not by uniting the people, but by stoking fear and anger. But fear cannot be a foundation. Anger cannot be a guide. When those forces dominate the social atmosphere, the people begin to lose faith, not only in the government, but in each other. And when faith is lost, peace follows closely behind. One does not need to see cities burning to know a nation is falling. Collapse begins much earlier. It begins when children grow up without hope, when neighbors no longer trust, when citizens no longer dream of a better tomorrow together. In Israel, these signs are becoming more frequent. The dream of a homeland is being replaced with the struggle for identity. The promise of security is being questioned by those it was meant to protect. And the cost of maintaining control is becoming too high, economically, socially, and spiritually. Division weakens not only the system, but the spirit. It makes people tired, bitter, and afraid. And when people live in fear, they stop creating, they stop loving, they stop growing. A society that cannot grow will eventually shrink, not just in numbers, but in meaning. And that is perhaps the greatest tragedy. Not the fall of a state, but the fading of its soul. Israel stands today not only on the edge of political upheaval, but on the brink of a spiritual collapse. Only by restoring the inner unity can it avoid the fall that division always promises. There is a delicate but powerful connection between leadership and the people it serves. In times of balance, that relationship feels like breath moving through the body, steady, natural, life-giving. But when disconnection arises, it is as though the breath becomes short, irregular, or absent. The body begins to weaken. So it is with nations. When those in power become distant from the spirit of the people, when they govern from above instead of alongside, the invisible lifeline that holds a nation together begins to fray. The story of Israel today is one of such a disconnection, where leadership is increasingly removed from the heart of the people, and as a result, the soul of the nation grows restless. The signs are not abstract. They are present in every conversation on the streets, in the energy of public demonstrations, in the resignation seen in the eyes of youth who feel unheard. A nation that is no longer guided by the spirit of its people is like a river trying to flow uphill. It resists the natural current and therefore invites collapse. Leadership is not simply about laws and decisions. It is about presence, wisdom, and alignment. In the same way a martial artist leads his body through breath and awareness, a true leader must guide a nation by remaining in touch with its needs, its pain, its aspirations. When the body becomes numb, injury follows. And when a government becomes numb to the voice of its people, injustice multiplies. In Israel, this numbness has begun to harden into policy. Instead of responding to the people's outcry with listening, it responds with force. Instead of recognizing division as a symptom of misalignment, it labels it as rebellion. Instead of seeking common ground, it fortifies its position and calls it strength. But strength that refuses to bend will break. The people can feel when decisions are made in closed rooms without consultation. They know when policies are formed not from care, but from calculation. This knowing creates distance, and distance becomes distrust. The deeper this distrust grows, the more unstable the structure becomes. It is a feedback loop. The more the people feel alienated, the louder their protests. The louder their protests, the more defensive the leadership becomes. Dialogue becomes war. Negotiation becomes resistance. And all the while, the fabric of the nation continues to thin. In such a climate, democracy becomes theater. Elections are held, but the people feel powerless. Laws are passed, but the people feel unseen. National symbols remain, but the connection to their meaning fades. This is not a unique pattern. It is a universal truth. When leadership separates itself from the people's experience, collapse is no longer a question of possibility, but of timing. In martial philosophy, when the mind leads the body with compassion and understanding, movements become graceful, coordinated. But if the mind is distracted, arrogant, or disconnected, the body stumbles. It injures itself. Israel's leadership today is like a distracted mind, focused on retaining control, reacting to opposition, managing perception, but not in harmony with the rhythm of the people. The mind may think it knows best, but the body remembers truth. The people remember, they remember promises made and broken. They remember the ideals of unity, peace, and justice that once formed the foundation of the state. And as they witness their leadership drift further away from these ideals, a quiet grief settles in. That grief turns into frustration. That frustration becomes unrest. And eventually that unrest transforms into detachment. Detachment is perhaps the most dangerous stage of collapse. When people still protest, still shout, still demand, they still believe change is possible. But when they grow silent, when they withdraw, when they begin to look elsewhere for identity and belonging, the nation begins to lose its soul. In Israel, a growing number of its citizens are reaching this stage. Emigration is rising. Disillusionment is spreading. National service is being questioned. This is not mere fatigue. It is a spiritual rupture. And no amount of military funding or foreign alliances can heal a soul that feels abandoned. Leadership that wishes to preserve the body of the state must first return to its heart. It must re-establish the sacred connection with its people, not through performance, but through humility. True leadership requires the ability to kneel before the truth of the people. It requires the courage to admit mistakes, to share power, to invite discomfort. These are not signs of weakness, they are signs of wisdom. Martial artist who refuses to acknowledge his limitations is already defeated. A leader who cannot face the truth of his people has already lost their trust. The collapse of Israel is not only about external threats or economic strain, it is deeply rooted in this disconnection between the governed and the governors. The people feel they are walking one path, while the leaders pursue another. The laws passed no longer reflect shared values. The direction taken no longer feels like it belongs to all. Even within Israel's leadership structure, this disunity is evident. Factions fight for dominance rather than collaboration. Ministers push personal agendas over national healing. The voice of reconciliation is drowned out by the drumbeat of control. In this echo chamber, leadership begins to confuse noise for consensus and resistance for progress. The consequence is that policies no longer protect, they divide. Institutions no longer inspire, they enforce. A nation in which leadership has turned its back on the collective soul of its people cannot thrive. It may survive a little longer through force, but it cannot flourish. Flourishing comes from harmony, from unity, from leadership that walks not ahead of the people, but beside them. There is still a path forward. It is narrow and difficult, but it exists. It begins with listening, not selective listening, but whole listening. Listening to the fear, to the anger, to the hope, to the pain. It requires a shift from power over people to power with people, from command to service, from control to connection. Just as a martial artist learns that the greatest strength comes from alignment, so too must a nation realize that real leadership flows from integrity. The people are the heartbeat of a country. If the leaders cannot hear that beat, they lose the rhythm. And without rhythm, every step becomes uncertain, every decision shaky. The disconnection between Israel's leadership and its people is no longer a whisper, it is a cry that echoes through streets filled with protesters, a cry that reverberates in the silence of those who have given up. If that cry continues to be ignored, the body will fall, not from attack, but from within. From the simple truth that no structure, however fortified, can stand long when its head forgets its heart. Collapse is not always sudden. Sometimes it is slow, a fading, a forgetting. And then one day, what once stood tall is simply no longer there. Leadership must remember the people or prepare to lead nothing. There is a powerful truth hidden within the nature of identity. When it is fluid, when it is based on purpose, on contribution, on connection, it becomes a source of strength. But when identity is fixed, in opposition, when it becomes rigid and tied to dominance, it slowly corrodes from within. Any group, any person, any nation that bases its sense of self on being against others instead of being for something greater will find that identity to be a prison, not a foundation. This is the final and perhaps most defining sign of collapse, when the identity of a nation becomes inseparable from force, from struggle, from the projection of might. Israel today finds itself locked in such a state of being. The lines between survival and dominance have blurred. The culture, the politics, even the education system carry this subtle but profound message that identity must be defended not with wisdom but with weapons. That to exist is to fight, that to belong is to oppose. And when this mindset becomes embedded into the bones of a people, collapse does not come from without, it comes from within the mind itself. When a martial artist trains only to defeat others, he eventually becomes bound to conflict. He loses the art, the elegance, the wisdom. His skill becomes a tool of reaction, not of transformation. Similarly, when a state begins to define itself through power, military strength, territorial control, surveillance and deterrence, it stops evolving. Its imagination shrinks, Its people begin to measure their success by how many threats they can neutralize, how many critics they can silence, how many enemies they can outlast. But a nation's purpose must be greater than its paranoia. Without a vision that transcends fear, a society will repeat the same defensive behaviors, even when no real threat exists. It becomes addicted to vigilance, paralyzed by the thought of peace. And in such a condition, the collapse is not dramatic, it is silent, slow, and invisible until the very end. Israel's reliance on force has become more than policy. It has become part of its identity. From a young age, children are taught to be alert, to prepare for war, to remember the past not as a lesson, but as a warning that must be fought again and again. While vigilance can be noble, when it becomes obsessive, it replaces growth with survivalism. It narrows the mind, it isolates the heart, and it ultimately divides people from themselves and each other. National holidays are marked more by memory of destruction than celebration of creation. Military service becomes not just a duty, but a rite of passage. These are not inherently wrong, but when they become the only definition of what it means to belong, to be loyal, to be worthy, then identity becomes entangled with struggle. And anything entangled with struggle must eventually break. It is important to understand that collapse does not always mean immediate failure. It often begins with subtle shifts in consciousness. People begin to equate compassion with weakness. They start to distrust dialogue. They see compromise as betrayal. These inner changes spread quietly, like cracks beneath the surface of a structure. The society keeps functioning, but the spirit begins to fade. People still go to work, children still go to school, leaders still give speeches. But the meaning behind these actions becomes hollow. There is no inspiration, no transformation, only preservation. And preservation, when rooted in fear, does not bring peace, it brings stagnation. When identity is attached to force, relationships become transactional. Alliances are based on usefulness, not values. Diplomacy is replaced by deterrence. Even within the nation itself, relationships fracture. Different communities are judged by their loyalty, their obedience, their willingness to conform. The society stops asking who are we becoming and instead asks only who is with us or against us. This binary mindset is the symptom of a collapsing identity. It leaves no room for diversity, for dissent, for dreams. People become pawns in a national performance of strength, not participants in a shared future. Israel has, over time, allowed this mindset to take root in both subtle and overt ways. The language of conflict has become so normal that peace feels foreign. Every call for reconciliation is viewed with suspicion. Every proposal of coexistence is challenged by narratives of security. The true danger is not in the policies themselves, but in how they shape the soul. A nation becomes what it constantly repeats to itself. If every message says, we must fight to exist, then existence becomes inseparable from fighting. And when the fight becomes the purpose, peace becomes a threat. In the martial tradition, the master teaches that the highest form of strength is the ability to avoid conflict without weakness, the ability to hold power but choose stillness, the ability to strike yet prefer silence. This wisdom is lost when identity is tied to dominance. Israel, at its core, was born from a yearning for peace, safety, and renewal. But over time, the trauma of the past hardened that yearning into defensiveness. And now, the very force that was meant to protect has begun to imprison. The lines between protection and possession have blurred. The desire to safeguard has turned into the instinct to suppress. This does not mean that threats do not exist. But when a nation uses those threats to justify every form of aggression, every expansion, every silencing, it begins to lose the ability to tell the difference between danger and discomfort. And this confusion leads to excess, excessive surveillance, excessive militarization, excessive suspicion. These do not build unity, they breed fear. And when a nation is ruled by fear, its identity becomes unstable. It becomes fragile. It must constantly be reinforced because it is not rooted in peace. It is floating on tension. The collapse of identity is not a dramatic fall, it is a quiet forgetting of who you really are. A nation that once dreamed of harmony begins to forget that dream. It replaces it with victory. But victory is temporary. Only purpose endures. And purpose must be rooted in something deeper than control. A state can win every battle and still lose its soul. It can silence every critic and still feel empty. It can expand its borders and still find its people shrinking inside. The warning is not just for Israel, it is for every nation, every group, every individual who ties their worth to control. When identity becomes fixed, it cannot grow, and what cannot grow must eventually collapse. Not because it was weak, but because it refused to bend. True identity is like water. It flows, it adapts, it nourishes. When it becomes like stone, it may appear strong, but it will shatter under enough pressure. The transformation begins with one question: who are we when we are not fighting? If the answer is unclear, then the foundation is uncertain. And from uncertain foundations, only uncertain futures can rise. Israel must rediscover its identity, not in power, but in peace. Not in defense, but in dignity. Not in silence, but in sincere listening. If it does not, the collapse will continue. Not in headlines, but in hearts. Not in explosions, but in emptiness. And one day, the people will wake up, not to the fall of a state, but to the fading of something sacred, their sense of who they were meant to be.